Hello, and welcome to all of you joining us for our virtual Martin Luther King Day celebration. My name is Brett Rowling, and I'm the branch manager of the Martin Luther King Library. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Milwaukee Public Library Foundation for their support and generosity in making this event happen. We hope you enjoy our upcoming program, Dr. King's Legacy and Our Future. And now, I would like to introduce our host for the program. Michelle London is a reporter for Milwaukee's Spectrum One News affiliate. She joined Spectrum One News 2 years ago and has uncovered important local stories, including the recent election, and with a focus on positive stories from Milwaukee's Black community. Please welcome Michelle London.
Brad, thank you so much for, first of all, the housekeeping rules and for that intro. I want to take this time to welcome everyone and thank you so much for joining us for MPL's annual Martin Luther King Day event. This year, yes, this year, we are making history. We like to look at the glasses half full, right? Well, we're making history as it's the first virtual event. And as an anchor of Spectrum News 1, Wisconsin, the only statewide 24/7 connection to news, weather, and sports, I'm so very honored to be your moderator this afternoon. We have two amazing speakers on deck. Both played a role in the civil rights movement, attorney Daphne Barbee-Wooten and Dr. Terrence Roberts, both currently using their experience from back then for good today. I want to remind everyone to begin to type in your questions as you hear both speakers, and we will have a time to have those questions answered towards the end of the event. We'll start with attorney Daphne Barbee-Wooten, daughter of prominent civil rights attorney Lloyd A. Barbee. Her roots started right here in Wisconsin, attending Milwaukee's Riverside High School, and then going on to receive her bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She went on to do, that wasn't it. She went on to get her law degree, become a Juris Doctor at the University of Washington. And she joins us now. This is the power of technology. She joins us right now from Honolulu, Hawaii. I just want to talk about a little bit about her awards really quick. She received in 2015 the Lifetime Achievement Award from Hawaii's NAACP along with her husband. And other awards include Civil Rights Attorney of the Year there in Hawaii. Thank you so much. Everybody give her a round of applause. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. You know, your story is so powerful, and I'd like for you to, as I give the floor over to you, share your story and then talk about how that has kind of shaped your experience in fighting for justice for others today.
Thank you, and I'm very privileged to be here virtually from Hawaii to Milwaukee. And I used to visit the Martin Luther King Library, the branch, as I did almost all of the libraries in Milwaukee. So thank you for having me, and happy Martin Luther King Day. I'd like to start, and I'll interweave with my story. And I think it was the cold that drove me to Hawaii, by the way, to be perfectly honest. I'd like to start with my story, which is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. And if you could show the Dr. Martin Luther King photograph. I have some photos to show you. And this one is
Okay, we'll wait just a few minutes. It sounds like Daphne went out there.
Painter painted it, and it's very colorful, and it shows Dr. Martin Luther King in a lei because he visited Hawaii and gave speeches at one of the oldest Hawaiian churches, Kauai Hau. And he also, when he did his March to Selma for Voting Rights Act, wore a lei from Hawaii. So there's a connection with Dr. Martin Luther King and Hawaii. At any rate, Dr. Martin Luther King's quote, "Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere." I have another photograph of my father, Lloyd A. Barbee, who, as many of you know, and now you will find out if you don't know, was a preeminent civil rights attorney and a legislator here in Wisconsin. And he proposed many civil rights laws. I think that's the photo of Dr. Martin Luther King. Here's my father at the Wisconsin State Capitol in Madison when he was a legislator. And he has a quote that I want to also state in conjunction with Dr. Martin Luther King's quote, which is, "There is only one race, the human race." And those two quotes are very important because they show that we're all connected. So we're not separate, we're all connected. And we need to understand that if you push someone down, you're not just pushing one person down, but many people down. And don't do it because we are all the same. In essence, we are all human beings. So there's no need to show prejudice against another person because maybe they don't look like you or they're not the same sex as you. Okay, the next item is another photograph. If you could show that. Okay, I was asked if I could list some ways to fight for justice. And the number one that I put down as a manner and a way to fight for justice is to vote. It's very important. It's extremely powerful. For those who say, oh, it doesn't make a difference, just look at the Atlanta elections and you realize that your vote does make a difference. And not just Atlanta, but if you recall in this election, Wisconsin was first up for Trump, and then they didn't count Milwaukee. And I knew sitting in Hawaii at midnight, I said, if they didn't count Milwaukee, that's wrong. And sure enough, when the Milwaukee votes were counted, it changed and it went for Biden. Well, the same thing happened in Michigan, right? Detroit came in, it was Biden. Same thing happened in Pennsylvania. When Philadelphia came in, it changed to Biden. And now we're gonna look at Atlanta, Georgia. And I knew that depending on what Steve Kornacki put on his election board, as we were riveted watching the elections, that if they didn't count Atlanta, it was gonna turn as soon as they counted Atlanta. All that's to say is the urban vote, as the news media call it, the urban vote matters. Black vote matters. And so the first thing I say that to make sure that you fight for justice is exercise your vote, because there's a long history of African Americans not being able to vote, of course, because of slavery, but also because of the obstructionists and the way in which many states disenfranchise Black votes. And quite frankly, it goes on today with the claims of not trying to count Atlanta or trying to change the Georgia vote. They're trying to disenfranchise many of the city and urban votes, which one can say is African American voters. So exercise your right to vote. It really matters, and this election showed that it does. And as this is a picture of John Ossoff and a picture of Reverend Warnock. And just a word of both of these senators. Reverend Warnock has the same church that Martin Luther King had as a preacher, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. So I think it's very significant on Dr. Martin Luther King's Day to realize that the torch has been passed to the next generation. And I know Dr. Martin Luther King is smiling and grinning actually in wherever he is for this historic election. And the same for John Ossoff, who was had a mentor named John Lewis, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So these two senators have turned the Senate and are going to change the manner in which people vote and change a lot of, I'd say, the legislation over there in the Senate and the Capitol this year. And I think they will be sworn in and ready to go by at least the 21st. The next thing you can do to fight for justice is help a campaign, call, give rides to the polls, help others to vote by registering it. And if we could have the next picture. Here she is, Stacey Abrams. Now, Stacey Abrams is very significant. She, along with a lot of other people, really did the hard work. They were in the trenches. They were calling people, visiting people, meeting up with people who never voted before, meeting up with people who just turned 18 and were about to vote. And in fact, I know from my husband's relatives who lived in Atlanta, he had just turned 18 and hadn't voted. And so, hey, he said, and we asked him, are you gonna vote? Yep, he said he registered. And Stacey Abrams was a motivating factor, a motivating person to do that. And so that's another way to fight for justice. If you disagree with what's going on around you, disagree with the politics, disagree with the rules, legislatures, get yourself into the game, help others to come along with you, and use your power to get them to vote. And I remember, you talk about what I remember as a girl when I was in Milwaukee is the same thing, mail outs for my father to have him elected, knocking on doors of the neighborhood, asking them to vote for my father. And some of the neighbors were so nice, they'd give us cookies and milk, but we were told, you're not supposed to eat anything, but we couldn't help it with the cookies. Help with the campaigns that we believed in. And you're never too young to start. The next way to fight for justice, as you know, I'm an attorney, my father was an attorney, is to make sure you serve on a jury. That's very important. And when my father was a legislator and fighting for civil rights in Milwaukee and Madison, he had a case where an African-American man was charged with a crime, I think it was burglary, and the jury was all white. No surprise, because in the 60s and the 50s, a lot of the jurors were white. And that's not a jury of your peer. And under the Constitution, you have a right to a jury for your jury of your peers. And so he took it all the way up to the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, and they actually won. And the Wisconsin court reversed the jury verdict and said, yes, this is not a jury of his peers. Well, the Supreme Court has taken that up several times. And in Batson versus, I believe Batson versus Kentucky. And they have also agreed that when a prosecutor strikes all non-whites from a jury when the defendant is non-white, that is not a jury of your peers. So the issue is, sometimes they come back with, well, we couldn't find any African Americans to serve on the jury. That's a bunch of crap. And please, if you get that jury notice, please sign up. You have no idea how important that is. As part of being a citizen of the United States, just like your right to vote, you have a right to sit on the jury, and make sure you do. And it can change a lot of things. The other thing I'd like to talk about, how to exercise your right to fight for justice, is education. Educate yourself. Go to the library, read books, and in the library you can get it for free. You can read books, booklets, pamphlets. You can use the internet now. Back in my days, we didn't have the internet, but you can use the internet. You can even go to book clubs and book reading groups. Go to speeches like this speech today. And it's all free. It's all educational. So educate yourself. And I believe there's a book list from Milwaukee Public Library that they will share with you. You can call them up, or you can go ahead and share it, and they're going to put it up for you.
Yes, and speaking of that list, Daphne, not to interrupt, but this is a good time to kind of segue and transition over to Milwaukee Public Library's website. Speaking of education, we have a list of your books right at our fingertips to check out, to learn more about. So of course you can visit mpl.org for that. And the floor is yours again. Thank you, Daphne.
Okay, thank you. If you could change to the next slide. I have some books. One is that I edited my father's book, For Justice for All, Sayings of Lloyd A. Barbee. He actually wrote the sayings and the things that are in the book. I just edited. I also did another book, African American Attorneys in Hawaii, which was recently updated. And then the next slide will show a lot of books available.
Your husband right there.
Yes, that was my husband with President Barack Obama. That's before Barack Obama became president. You know, he's from Hawaii, and we had the pleasure of meeting him and his lovely wife, Michelle Obama. Ooh, I mean, they are just so down to earth. And this is one of the few pictures with him when he got laid, meaning a lei around his neck, which is a Hawaiian tradition to give honor and respect. He doesn't wear that much now, and I found out why, because I'm reading his book, which is another book all of you got to read, about how he was advised not to have any flowers, to wear colors and no aloha shirts by his advisors. Don't ask me why, but they said voters would find that more appealing. And well, anyways, this is my husband with a colorful aloha shirt, and this is President Obama when he was a senator from Chicago, Illinois. And they were just so lovely and so down to earth. Their 2 children were with them, very accessible. It's a little harder now, even though I understand he's still in Hawaii on vacation. But back then, before he was president, he was very accessible. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's just me in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Historical Press. Shout out to them because they published the book, and that's me with a lot of books. Okay. But besides those books that I'm involved in, there are a lot of other books. And I would encourage you also to read Kamala Harris's book, which was published last year before she ran for vice president and won. And that is called The Truths We Hold. And it's a fascinating book about her life, being raised in Oakland, California, and with her mother and her father, who's from Jamaica. St. Anne's, Jamaica, and her sister, and they were raised in the civil rights era. They went marching in Oakland for civil rights, and it's interesting to see her change and move on towards a politician, and now becoming the first African-American female vice president. Very historic and historic. The other things you can do is to help your neighbor or others in need, whether it's food, clothing, travel assistance, helping someone to go see a doctor, bringing medical supplies, checking in on them, checking in on the older people, younger people too, helping them out. And maybe they need some money for a book for school, or they need help to go to school. I believe Milwaukee, the library has what's called a website for assisting with your neighbors and helping others. And also be nice, be kind, smile at people. A smile goes a long way. I remember walking down the street in Honolulu, and as something heavy was on my mind, I think I was going to court, and I was practicing my arguments in my mind. And this older man was walking right in front of me. And so he stopped in front of me, and I smiled, and he said, "You just made my day." You never know where people are in life. You don't know if they're depressed. They just want somebody to smile at them, and that really helps. And to be kind to others. Now, another way to exercise and fight for justice is when you see something is wrong, you stand up for your rights, if it's you, and stand up for the rights of the other person. And I'm talking about George Floyd, a little 17-year-old teenager shot that video that the world saw. Had she not shot that video, it may have just been another African-American acting up, being killed by the police. But because she shot that video, it just forecasted to the world that Black Lives Matter is necessary and needed in today's society. Now, so if you see something that's wrong, don't be shy to take out your video and shoot it and get it on tape and put it on the news, because it can change the world. It really can. And so be a witness to make sure injustice is not allowed and does not continue. Protest by writing letters, marching, supporting organizations, writing books, and running for political office. And now I'm going to talk about a little bit about Black Lives Matter. You know, this isn't the first protest in our history of fighting for the rights of Black men and women who are victims of police brutality. And George Floyd is just one example. All throughout slavery, you've had the codes and the slave runners and, killing Black men and Black women. But in modern day society with the iPhones, it just reaches so much more people, not just African Americans. And in Hawaii, we had a Black Lives Matter protest, as did around the nation. There were a lot of Black Lives Matter protests. And this is a picture I took of some of the protesters, and these are high schoolers, 17-year-olds just doing it, making sure that everybody in Hawaii knows that they stand with Black Lives Matter. And there were actually thousands of people at the Capitol. This is shot near the Capitol. And in the background, you can see they're crossing the street. But there were thousands of young people, mostly under 20, mostly from high school, that came there to protest Black Lives Matter in Hawaii, along with their brothers and sisters on the mainland and in Milwaukee and in Kenosha. And so anyways, this is just a picture that I wanted to show. And so the other thing is to make sure Black Lives Matter and will always matter. And I would say also to study history and show respect for those who came before you and fought for civil rights. And so I have a slide of some of the civil rights icons you can read up on. Very important to know it didn't just start in 2020. The civil rights movement has been around for a while. I'm going to start with Harriet Tubman. Of course, she's the great abolitionist who brought many African Americans who were enslaved from the South off the plantations to the North and even in Canada to get away from slavery. This is called Moses, Grandma Moses. So I encourage everybody to study about her. And there's also a movie that came out, I think in 2019 about Harriet Tubman, but there's more to learn about her besides just the Underground Railroad, but she also went on to become one of the first Civil War veterans, women in the Civil War, a nurse, and she received a pension, one of the first African-American women to receive a pension from the Civil War. Next slide. This is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was an outspoken abolitionist who would go to many meetings, and especially to women's suffrage meetings. And they would usually have predominantly, I think almost always, white women speakers. And she would march up and she'd say, "Ain't I a woman?" And she would talk about slavery. She would talk about what she did in slavery. And "Ain't I a woman?" And so she basically broke the color barrier to the white women's suffrage and ensured that everybody knew African-American women have the right to vote as well and should be included in the suffrage movement. The next slide is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, he also was a slave, freed himself, and was very active in the abolitionist movement. He had a newspaper called the Freedmen's Bureau. And if many of you want to study about it, you can go back and actually read his articles. And in fact, just a little side note, one of the people that he worked with moved to Hawaii, and he was the first Black lawyer in Hawaii, T. McCants Stewart. And so when I was researching T. McCants Stewart, which is in the African American Attorneys in Hawaii book, I saw that he wrote for the Freedmen's Bureau. I saw that he represented many people who were suing for their civil rights to go to white hotels in New York, and that he was a friend of Frederick Douglass. And if you go to Frederick Douglass's page and his papers, you can see his correspondence with T. McCants Stewart. The next is Huey P. Newton. This is a picture taken of Huey P. Newton when he came to Madison, Wisconsin to give a speech. Huey P. Newton was one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party, and the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And of his 10-point programs, number one was self-defense, because many African-American men who were driving vehicles were pulled over by the police, beaten, arrested for no crime, and even in some instances killed and murdered. So Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale decided they're going to form an organization for self-defense of Black people. So they would get calls that they see police pulling over a Black man, and they'd show up with their rifles. They didn't have cell phones. They had rifles and guns. And they'd sit there and they'd watch the police. Police got very intimidated, but they had a right to be armed, and they would watch. So the police started a war against the Black Panther Party and the FBI. They did more than just self-defense. They also feeded the hungry. They had breakfasts for poor children. They had alternative schools teaching Black history. But he was one of the first Black Lives Matter, and he didn't need a cell phone. He just brought his gun and stared at the police officers. But he came and gave a speech in Madison, so this is a picture of him. And I was fortunate enough to meet him. Next slide is Kamala Harris. I love this picture because it shows a little girl walking, and Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, the first woman of color, African, Jamaican, Indian, but Jamaicans, of course, are African because slavery was very prominent in Jamaica. And here she is walking to the White House. It just makes me feel so proud and should make everyone feel proud. And again, she has also written a book. I know I've talked about Barack Obama's book, but her book is also very interesting. And I would encourage all of you to go to the library and borrow it. The next is Barack Obama giving the Medal of Freedom to John Lewis. Now, as you know, John Lewis, he recently passed away, and a congressman from Georgia. And a great man. He was instrumental in the Voting Rights Act, marching across the Pettus Bridge for voting rights. He got beaten severely by the police, and someone did take a picture of it. Kept going, persevered, kept fighting. He fought for the last minute of his life for civil rights, and a lot of respect for him. And so glad that President Obama gave him this Medal of Freedom. And an honor, and we should honor him as well. And so we should celebrate our heroes and heroes as we're doing in this seminar. And in the words of John Lewis, we need to make good trouble, not bad trouble, but good trouble. Trouble that causes people to change their minds about civil rights and think of it as a positive thing, because we are all one after all. So let's treat each other as we are all one. The next slide is my father making good trouble in Milwaukee and Madison. He could get to that. All right, here's my father. He's trying to get to the Capitol, and I remember buying him that dashiki he's got on with his overcoat. He's trying to make it to the Capitol to make a vote, and the National Guard are stopping him, and he doesn't let them stop him. He just makes good trouble, gets up to the Capitol, and exercises his vote and makes a speech on the Capitol. And someone took this picture and put it in the newspaper. Next slide. Here he is making good trouble because of the segregated schools in Milwaukee. They did protests to stop the segregation before he filed a lawsuit. He eventually had to file a lawsuit to stop the segregation in Milwaukee public schools. But this is him at the very beginning with some of the people. He's the one with the glasses to the far left, your far left. They arrested him. And at the time he was in the state legislature, you could see the police hauling him off to be arrested. So because he was in the state legislature, he had immunity. So they had to drop the charges against him. But many other people didn't have immunity. So he went on to represent them in court. And unfortunately, the judges were white at the time, male, and a terrible judge named Judge Serafin, who was quite racist, would find most of the protesters, find them guilty of disorderly conduct, and fine them. And then so I just want to say, I don't want to take up too much time because Dr. Roberts is coming on, and he's another person, a hero we should recognize, because he also made good trouble, and I'm sure he's going to talk about the good trouble he made. So thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Attorney Barbee, thank you so much for sharing your story, encouraging us all to be the change, as we don't really have any excuses after hearing all that you've shared to sit back and be inactive. There are so many wonderful facts and information about prominent leaders in Black history, and you shared a lot of that today. And speaking of taking action, it's another good time to head back over to MPL's website, where we can all be the change and do our part and take part in volunteering. Again, that website is mpl.org. All right, I want to shift gears now to our next speaker of the hour, Dr. Terrence Roberts. As one of the Little Rock Nine, Dr. Roberts has been in demand by a number of groups who wish to learn about the impact of the chaos in Little Rock on the social, cultural, and political life of citizens in contemporary America. He's the CEO of Terrence Roberts Consulting, a management firm devoted to fair and equitable practices in business and industry. A graduate of the California State University at Los Angeles and UCLA, where he received his master's degree, Dr. Roberts went on to obtain his PhD in psychology from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. Wow. Dr. Roberts, turning the floor over to you now. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's time for you to share your story.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And my thanks to all of those who were involved in putting this program together and extending an invitation to me to participate. I was especially glad to get the invitation because I've always known that one of the most important things we can do in our society is to understand who the people are who give us our marching orders. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one such person. I had the privilege of meeting him in 1958. He, along with a couple of his lieutenants, Glenn Smiley and Jim Lawson, came to Little Rock when the nine of us that you know as the Little Rock Nine were involved in the chaotic uproar that came in the wake of our attempt to enter Central High School. Dr. King suggested to us that we should consider nonviolence. It made so much sense. Then he began to explain the whole concept to us. He and Lawson and Smiley were very concerned because we were quite young and they weren't sure that we'd be able to stand up against the pressure that was sure to come. Now, I must say to you, we were very young and fairly naive. And even though all of us had been born in Little Rock and we knew what was possible, we didn't have the imagination that extended to include a vicious mob intent upon killing us. And yet, we all agreed to accept nonviolence as our mode of operation. As an individual, I was especially elated because I thought the idea of fighting made no sense at all. I was always for nonviolence. In fact, my mom told me when I was quite young that as a human animal, she said, yes, you are an animal, but you are a human animal. And as such, you have other options. You may fight, you may choose to fight, but you have so many other things at your disposal. You have the power of speech. You can communicate, you can negotiate, you can dialogue, you can compromise, you can share, and long list of other things. She didn't take away my choice to fight. She said, if you want to fight, that's on you. I advise against it, but I'm not the one who can make your decisions. So I was thrilled to take nonviolence with me into Central High School, and I learned a lot about myself because nonviolence in a cluster of people who speak the language of violence is an anomaly, and it was not appreciated. And so the nine of us were beaten daily, but we hung in there. I don't know how we all survived. I've often had the question, how did the nine of you make it through there without being killed? I don't have an answer for that. All I can know is that we all did make it through. But Dr. King came back to Little Rock toward the end of the school year because one of our group, Ernie Green, was graduating. Dr. King was able to join the Green family. The restrictions were such that the nine of us, but of the nine of us, only Ernie and his family were allowed to go to the ceremony. It was considered too dangerous on the part of the administrators. So none of us could go, but Dr. King passed himself off as an uncle to Ernie. He joined the family and actually went to the ceremony. Following the ceremony, he, along with the Green family, joined all of us who had gathered at the home of Daisy Bates. Daisy Bates was then the president of the Arkansas State chapter of the NAACP. And we were in her basement getting the rundown on what had happened at the ceremony. And that was a marvelous time because I got to talk to Dr. King up close and personal and to learn more about his devotion to this whole concept of nonviolence. What I found out was that nonviolence wasn't the only thing on his mind. He was especially concerned about the soul of this country. His main focus was on trying to find a way that he could be instrumental in helping us understand the sickness we suffered from and how we might go about remedying that sickness. We talked a lot about that. Another aspect of his thinking included notions about what he called the beloved community. And that was, again, something that resonated with me because I've always known that we are not individuals in this universe. There's no such thing as a self-made person. We are all dependent and interdependent upon each other. In fact, the truth of it is, all of us start life hooked up via an umbilical cord. Once we're born, that umbilical cord is snipped. But at that point, we're charged with the responsibility of forging new relationships with a larger group of people other than just mom. Building human relationships, though, is hard work, as most of you know from your own lives. It's very, very difficult. In fact, I have a colleague who always says to me, building human relationships is the hardest job in the world. I quite agree with him. But it is well worth the effort. We are relational beings. We need each other. That's why conditions in this country right now are so frightening, because we seem to have lost the impetus to move toward building relationships across these many, many barriers that we face. Dr. King never really understood why it wasn't possible for more of us to join him. In fact, he was considered a pariah by many people, especially white Americans. Many white Americans thought he was the devil. They did this by yelling and screaming when they saw him, or doing whatever they could do to interfere with any program that he might develop. There's one that stands out for me, and that's when he was thrown in jail down in Birmingham, Alabama, for going to help the people in Birmingham. He had been invited from his base in Atlanta to come to Birmingham to help out because the oppression was so the oppression involved everybody in that city, especially Black people, and they didn't know what to do. So they called in Dr. King as someone to help them. For his efforts, he was thrown into jail. And while there, he wrote this wonderful letter from Birmingham jail. That is one of the things that I practically reread every year. But I'll read an excerpt from it because he was charged with being in the wrong place. The white citizens of Birmingham said, "You're an outsider, you don't belong here." The letter was written by 8 white clergymen. Dr. King considered them brothers, and so he felt an obligation to respond in writing. With other things, he said this, in response to them calling him an outsider. He said, "But more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their 'Thus saith the Lord' far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid." That is so resonant for me. We, as individuals, have to take on the responsibility of going where injustice is and doing what we can to move it aside and replace it with justice. There's a novelist by the name of Bernard Malamud, wrote a novel in the mid-60s entitled The Fixer. And there's one line in that novel that still stands out for me today, and it is this: "In a sick country, any sign of health is seen as an insult to those who live off the sickness." And that to me sums up what Dr. King's vision was about. He saw the sickness. He knew that we were soul sick, but he also understood that many, many people lived off the sickness. For centuries, we lived off the sickness of slavery. After that, we lived off the sickness of Jim Crow. We're now living off the madness and sickness of mass incarceration of Black and brown bodies. These bodies have been commodified and used in the capitalistic exchanges that go on. That's the kind of sickness we face today. How do we as individuals respond to that? Well, we do something that Daphne referred to earlier, among other things, and that is to read. Read voraciously. Read as if your life depended upon it. And in many cases, it absolutely does. Because if you don't know what's coming, you just might be victimized by those who really don't mind taking you out. I'm reminded of a remark made by an Alabama sheriff years ago to civil rights worker Charles Sherrod. This sheriff said to him, "Sherrod, it's just mind over matter. I don't mind, you don't matter." That was a preliminary thought that probably led to the development of something we know today as Black Lives Matter. Black lives do matter. Charles Sherrod's life mattered then and now. A young middle school student raised his hand in one of my lectures once and he said, "Dr. Roberts, what do you think about the Black Lives Matter movement?" I said, "Young man, I consider myself to have been inducted into the Black Lives Matter movement on December 3rd, 1941, the day of my birth. And I've been an active soldier since. I will be a soldier on the day I die. Count on it." I took my baton from those who had lived before me. My task now is to pass the baton to those of you who are behind me. Your turn has come. I am in the fourth quarter. For me, at my age, it is fourth and goal. I have to be very, very aware of what I can continue to do to make it all happen. Just last week, I ran across another book. I am so into reading that my bedside table is not big enough to hold all the books at close at hand. But there's one book that I just got a hold of last week. I've already reread twice, and that is a book called Ordinary Hazards, written by Nikki Grimes. And I don't know if you are a young person, because Nikki does a lot of writing for young people. If you're not acquainted with this woman, do indeed pick up her book, Ordinary Hazards. It's amazing. She's a poet, and she's not afraid to speak her truth. I encourage you not only to read, but to write. As you read, you will discover that reading is a way to learn. Writing is a way to share what you've learned, because you can't help but learning new things about yourself when you read. Read the works of Dr. King. I have a volume that's called The Collected Works of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They're wonderful works. You know, Dr. King was the kind of person who knew in advance that he would be called upon to do things and be involved in things that were life-threatening. How did he manage to build in enough wherewithal to make it happen? He read voraciously. He read people like Reinhold Niebuhr. He read people who were able to speak to his soul. He read people who thought differently than he did, because he also needed to know what other people were thinking. You know, if you only read what you already know, you're not doing yourself any favors. So extend your reading circle to reach out to those whose mindset is so different from your own. More than that, when you read, you might be motivated to write. I think that every human being needs to write his or her story. Why? Because our stories are the things that help to link us together. Now, if we don't know each other's story, we make things up. Take the plight of Black people in this country. And this is something else that Dr. King talked about. You have to know who you are. You have to understand who you are and what you're all about. And you have to allow other people to hear you either speak your truth or read who you are, not be defined by who they think you are. I don't know exactly how we manage this, but I do know that the more energy you put into knowing who you are, high-level self-awareness, you are able then to speak your truth with some vigor. And also, if you're motivated to write, I have encouraged all of my fellow Niners to write, and several of us have written books. But you may think that you are not making the kind of history that deserves to be written down. Not true, not true. Every story is important. Every story is valuable. In fact, sometimes when people ask me, how does it feel to have made history? I say, look, that's the only thing I can do. That's the only thing any of us can do, is make history, because that's how it works. Time passes, the historical record is there. And if you don't write your story, somebody else will. take it upon yourself to make sure that the story is written as truth, your truth, and not from someone else. Now, I'm going to wind up my remarks here because I think the most important part of this program is going to be the dialogue we have together. Your questions will become the catalyst to move this dialogue along. And so I'm going to end with one thing, and that is this statement. If what you know at this point hasn't changed you, by all means, change what you know. Go forth and take the legacy of Dr. King with you as you commit yourself to being the best person you can be from this point on. Thank you.
Dr. Roberts, what an honor. Can we give him a hand clap? What an honor to have you here with us. Your story is so very powerful. You've encouraged us today to read and write. And speaking of your story, some of your books can be found at mpl.org. And I love your point about going where injustice is and then replacing that with justice. And we've been watching out. Yes, we've been watching out for your questions. And as Dr. Roberts has mentioned, we want to open up the floor for a bigger conversation. I want to read one question. It says, and this is for Dr. Roberts, it says, Terrence, I'm Erin Maben from Fox 6 News in Milwaukee. What do you think Dr. King would share with us today in this political climate we live in as we work to move forward as a country?
I think one of the first things he would ask us is it surprising what's happening? And if so, where have you been? Because all of what we're experiencing was broadcast before. Reading the historical record prepares us for that. You know, if you understand who we are as a country, now we have unfortunately absorbed something I call the approved national narrative, but that is not the truth. The truth of who we are is quite different. And when you go diving into the historical annals, all the way back to the year 1619 and work your way forward, you begin to develop an understanding that goes far beyond what you often hear from those who are around you, especially. If you are in an inner circle of people who are who are pledged allegiance rather to the national narrative, you will never hear the truth. You've got to stop your ears to that and find the truth on your own. And that way you can not only be prepared for what's coming, but be able to alert other people around you that they too need to be alert. This is coming. This is coming. Donald Trump actually advertised himself. He told us who he was. As he came down that escalator, he was speaking a truth. Most of us ignored it, unfortunately. But if you know in advance, you can take steps and measures to head it off before it even happens. Now, I'll now take a risk here and become a prognosticator and say that as the new regime starts, the Biden-Harris regime, are they going to have welcoming by the majority of people out there? Perhaps, but perhaps not, because I think a lot of people will sit back and say, oh, I'm so glad they're here, but they're not going to do anything to help them. What that will do then is open the door for those extremists who don't want them there to speak their truth as loud as possible. So I anticipate disaster at some point. I don't know what form it's going to take. And I don't want you to feel despair because I say that. I just want you to be prepared for what's possibly coming down the line. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And this next one is for Attorney Daphne. Was your father involved in any of the protests with Father Grappy?
Yes, he was. And in fact, he represented Father Grappy in his protests for welfare reform at the Capitol. And that's the one where the police, I showed a photograph where the National Guard were trying to stop him from coming into the Capitol. And he actually represented Father Grappy in a number of his arrests for disorderly conduct. And he was actually one of the spearheading many of the protests. So my father was not only representing Father Grappy, but he also started many of the protests where Father Grappy also was involved in. So absolutely, and you can read about it in the book, but you can also go to the library and look at the archives and actually see about the protests. For example, we marched, it wasn't the Pettus Bridge, but it was the Milwaukee Bridge from north to the south side of Milwaukee, which was predominantly white, for fair housing. And Father Grappy was involved with that, as well as many of the commandos, some of whom still live today, the NAACP commandos. You know, it'd be good to have a little session with them and talk about what happened. But and I was there, we marched across the bridge, and there were people yelling, people with broken bottles, threatening the children, threatening to kill us. They threw sour fruit at us. They spat on us. So this was not the South, this was the North, and it was in Milwaukee. So yes, my father was there, his children, my brothers, my two brothers were there. A lot of other children from the NAACP were there, and Father Grappy was there as well.
Wow, and you kind of touched on this a little bit. Was there ever an instance where you were concerned for the safety of your father, causing the good trouble that he was?
All the time, every day. And in fact, when I was young, I got this phone call, my friend and I think I was like 9, and we got a phone call from somebody who threatened to come over and kill us, in addition to my father. And so my friend and I decided to hide under the bed till my father came home because we were afraid. We were 9 years old, we didn't know. And we ran out under his bed crying. And we said, Daddy, you know, this guy called and he says he's gonna come and kill me and kill my friend and kill you, blah, blah, blah. And he looked at us, he says, don't let that stop you from doing whatever you wanna do. He says, you know, if someone wants to kill me, they're gonna kill me, but I'm not gonna stop. And you shouldn't be afraid. This is just all talk, they're cowards, and just keep on marching on and fighting. So yes, I was afraid quite a bit, but he talked me out of it, or, you know, just said, hey, this is life, it's reality.
Thank you so much, Daphne. And this is actually a comment to Dr. Roberts. It is from Betsy, one of Betsy to our panelists. You are an icon and legend to all. Our students and parents of today need to see the replay so they understand how you played a major role for us to become educated and arrive at the high level of personal achievement.
Thank you.
Anything you want to say? Any reply, any response to that?
Well, I think it's great to have people motivated by looking at the story surrounding the events in Little Rock. That's wonderful, and that's one of the pluses. So opportunity to learn what happened there from it, all the positives you can. There's some positives there.
Also, just being a part of Little Rock 9, how were you able to just mentally survive? What were some I guess tactics that you used to help you cope each day while you were going through that?
I use a lot of internal devices, mental devices, if you will. Poetry was one of them. I recited poetry to keep myself balanced and also to ward off the fear that was overwhelming me. I learned how I could corral that fear by taking responsibility and controlling it. And also to know that other people weren't making me afraid. I was responding to them with fear. And once I figured that part out, then that along with the poetry, it helped me remain some balance. I'll never forget there's one poem that some of you may know. It's called Invictus. As a young child, I recited that poem endlessly. And it helped. Later on, my spiritual growth forced me to put that poem aside, but at the time, it was one of my mainstays.
Wow. And so poetry was one of your tools for survival. That's
Yes,
awesome.
absolutely. And not only did I read others' poetry, I wrote poetry of my own, because poetry is a way of expressing your emotions. Now, and other people can read them, and what they get from them is not your emotions, but what you have written, if it's good poetry, will elicit from them emotions that exist in the poem that you wrote for yourself. So the poem has universal application.
Amazing. Attorney Daphne, when you live in Hawaii, obviously, do you notice a cultural difference there as a Black woman? Do you find it more or less challenging as an attorney of color there?
It is challenging to be an attorney in Hawaii, a woman and a woman of color in Hawaii, but it doesn't stop me. It doesn't stop my clients from hiring me. It doesn't stop me from winning cases, because you just move forward. I have had judges make bad comments. but you just move forward. You know, it's hard right now in Hawaii. They are, at least the Hawaii Supreme Court is trying to have seminars on diversity. They even had a seminar last weekend on Black Lives Matter in Hawaii, because there is a large population of African Americans and the military as well, African Americans in the military here in Hawaii. It is challenging, but you know what? I would be challenged in Wisconsin. I think I would be challenged in New York. And so it's the same sort of power. It's a power structure that doesn't like differences, is not familiar with differences. There's a certain element of people in power, and I'm talking about mainly white male judges who feel that this is their club and you don't really belong, and what are you doing here? But you just ignore them because it's not your reality. And you push upon them, and if you start winning cases, they kind of back off. And I think that's where the law really helps. If you have a civil rights law, they can't very well disregard it. And if they do disregard it, you take it up on appeal. And if you win the appeal, they back off a little. So yeah, it is a challenge. I'm not gonna lie and say it's a piece of cake, because it's not. And there is more ethnic diversity in Hawaii than I think in any other state. As far as proportions, you have Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos, Micronesians, Polynesians, Hawaiians, Caucasians, and African Americans. So there is a more diversity in Hawaii. Okay. You also find that people in jail tend to be browner. Is that interesting? Brown people make a disproportionate amount of people in jail. And a lot of them are Hawaiian, part Hawaiians. And yet this is Hawaii. And a lot of Hawaiians feel this is really not a state. It's their kingdom that was overthrown by the planters and the US government. So it's a different feel to it altogether. But at the same time, there, of course, if you look at who's the top 10% of the wealth or top 10% of the Fortune 500 of Hawaii, you will see very little color, maybe one or two women. And you'll sit there and go, same as in the mainland.
Well, that's going to conclude our Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration. You both have been amazing and so insightful. We're so honored to have you both on. Remember to always support your local public libraries in and around Wisconsin. And due to COVID-19, it's been a little bit different safety-wise. MPL is ensuring that you have necessary options when it comes to picking up your books, and that includes curbside pickup and, of course, online. Brett, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you to our panelists, Daphne Barbee-Wooten and Terrence Roberts, and to Michelle London for her wonderful hosting of the program. Thank you also to Charlie Palmer, whose generosity with his time and his books is above and beyond. I'd like to thank everyone from MPL involved in assembling and supporting this program today, including our city librarian, Joan Johnson, Public Services Area Manager, Ann Rasmussen, and our King Day Planning Committee, which includes staff members who've joined us today, Lydia Nimke, Paul Wellington, Keontae Thompson, and most of all, Joy Zanders, whose tireless effort every year makes every King Day a very special event. Thanks to all of you, and I hope you've enjoyed what we brought today.
Thank you.